Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Okay, everybody, I am joined by Dr. Maya Kornberg. She is a senior researcher in elections and government program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law. She is the author of articles and papers and books, and her soon-to-be published book could not be more timely or important. It's called, funnily enough, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. And it'll show up just about the time we need the next Congress to figure out how to make itself a little more popular than, say, I don't know, a thunderstorm at a picnic. Maya, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me and for making time to discuss what I think could not be a more timely topic.
Yes, right. But before we get into why it's timely now, I want to ask you, as I know Americans are frustrated with Congress. Chicago had a street called Congress Street. We renamed it.
Wow, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, it's Ida B. Wells. Forget Congress. Nobody cared that Congress was gone. People are frustrated with it. I just don't think highly of it. But I want to ask before we get into now, hasn't it always been this way? I mean, people have complained about Congress since the dawn of time. Was it ever better?
So certainly Congress is an institution that people like complaining about. I think you're right about that. But I make the case frequently as a congressional scholar that Congress has changed a lot, even in the last 50 years, which is the period in which I focus my most recent book on. And people used to believe in Congress a lot more than they do now. There was just a poll released saying that only 10% of Americans approve of the way that Congress is doing its job right now. That is a near historic low. So when we're thinking about, has it always been the case? Well, it hasn't always been this bad. And if we look at why Americans might be feeling that way, Congress is underperforming by a lot of metrics. It is passing less laws. It is, meeting less frequently. There are more government shutdowns than we used to have. So there's a lot of reasons to point to as to why only 10% of Americans might be approving of the way that Congress has done its job. And I think that is new, the kind of the scale of congressional ineffectiveness and frustration with Congress.
Yeah. And this discontent with Congress that we have right now, your point is that it is not vibes, it's based on performance.
It's hard to pin down why people are unhappy with Congress. And there is a paradox that we know in political science, which is that people tend to like their individual congressperson a whole lot more than they like the institution. Right. I do think that obviously part of any favorability poll is vibes, but I think that there is good reason to think that Congress is not doing enough, as I mentioned, I point to kind of structural issues that are really inhibiting individual Congress people, really preventing them from, delivering for the American people and doing their jobs in the way that people wanted them to when they elected them. So that's part of what I try to do in my research.
Let's talk about that. So for regular listeners of mine know that I have made the point for years, and I realize it's a little simplistic, but that Citizens United and radical gerrymandering broke Congress. That individual members work for the map makers and the money and not for the people who elected them in this system. I'm sure that is true, but I'm sure it is not completely the story. There's more to it. And I'd love to get your sense of what broke Congress.
Well, first of all, I think that you are right to point out that money is a major distortion. That is part of the reason that the subtitle of a book called Stuck about Congress is how money, media, and violence prevent change. Mm-hmm. And I would actually point to an earlier Supreme Court decision before Citizens United, which is the Buckley v. Vallejo decision in 1976. Yeah.
All
The
right, explain
Buckley,
that to everybody, because
right,
it was also the on-ramp to Citizens United, but yes.
100%. Yeah. So in 1976, the Supreme Court in the Buckley v. Vallejo decision rules that spending limits are unconstitutional in campaigns. And as a result, money starts flooding campaigns. And that is when I think we see things start to change in terms of money distorting pathways to power, even within Congress, not to mention running for office then becoming a lot more expensive. So one of the stories that I tell in the book is of Henry Waxman, right after the Buckley v. Vallejo decision, starting a leadership PAC. He understood that now money was the name of the game, and he represented a safe and a very affluent district in Beverly Hills. And so he had a lot of money, and he was campaigning to be a committee chair. And so he thought, okay, I can only donate so much money from my campaign committee to other members. But if I start what's called a leadership PAC, I can donate more money to other members to literally curry favor and campaign by paying them. And he ended up winning the chairmanship. Now you fast forward 50 years, almost every single member of the United States House of Representatives has a leadership PAC, and they exchange money to build relationships with each other. Members are now expected to pay dues to the party, sometimes millions of dollars to the party. And this is kind of an expectation, especially if you want leadership positions in the party or on committees. And so there is a literal pay-to-play system in Congress right now that I think cannot be understated in terms of the way that it distorts things. And certainly that started with Buckley v. Vallejo, and then it accelerated with the 2010 Citizens United decision that you just mentioned. I think that that is a major distortion, and I would completely agree with you on that. But I think that there are also other factors that people don't
Go to the other factors yet. Let's stay with this one, because I want to go back. I know you said it and you were very clear about it, but I want to say it again because it's so unusual for people. People have figured out that money makes a difference in who gets elected, right? But your point, which is astonishing, is that money passed around Congress by congressmen makes a difference in who gets committee chairs, who gets in the leadership, right? Who sets the agenda that gets on the table, so that it's not like when you elect your members, they show up and they are all equal and they all have the same votes.
Right.
Turns out that if you are elected from a fabulously wealthy district and you are a good fundraiser, you end up having a bigger voice within in interesting ways.
100%. Yeah. And I think that it's not just if you're elected from a wealthier district. This should also concern us because it reinforces structural disadvantages that are faced by groups with less access to wealth in general in the United States. So in my book, I tell the story of Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman who represented a largely working class district, saying to a staffer, I don't know how I'm going to leverage my constituents and my constituency that I represent in order to pay the dues that I need to pay to the party. So again, that is wild to think about. This is not a member saying, to your point, it's not a member saying, I don't know how I'm going to raise the money that I need to get reelected, because that costs a lot of money these days. This is a member saying, how am I going to pay off the party? How am I going to pay my dues to the party that I need in order to move ahead in the chamber? And so we know that women have less access to wealth in this country. We know that working Americans have less access to wealth. We know that people of color have less access to wealth. And when that makes it, we know that makes it harder for them to run. But just to reinforce your point, I don't think we talk as often about the fact that makes it harder for them to build power once they are elected.
Yeah, I mean, Rahm Emanuel got into leadership very quickly when he was a congressman, and he did it because he was a superb fundraiser.
Yeah, I think it's just the name of the game now. There is a great new book by a political scientist named Danielle Thompson called The Money Signal, which argues that even when you're looking at who's a viable candidate and you're in a party or in a kind of a candidate pipeline, you look at fundraising. So, the kind of discriminatory effects of that start early on. And it is difficult to overstate how different this is from what it was just 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I think people assume, especially young people, that it was always this way, that this was just always the way that it was. But in the book, I also tell stories of, Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman running in Brooklyn in the early 70s, running against an incumbent congressperson, mind you, and she was told you need to raise $100,000 to win. She was able to raise only $30,000 and she won that seat. Now, I'm in Brooklyn now, and the thought of even if you take into account inflation, the thought of anyone being able to run for office, let alone unseat an incumbent by raising the equivalent today of $30,000 is just unfathomable.
Unfathomable. Unfathomable. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Okay. So, and it's not just that you need the money to build those relations. The congressmen themselves, the congress people themselves, they don't actually spend the same amount of time with each other they used to. I mean,
Right.
partly the money has them focused out raising money all the time. I mean, back in the day, Bob Michel and Dan Rostenkowski, two leaders from different parties, but both from Illinois, would drive to DC together.
Yeah.
And they were, I mean, that kind of building of relationships doesn't exist. It's much more transactional.
100%. And I would point to the 1994 election as a major inflection point in the story of why members are no longer just friends and sending their kids to the same school in DC. It used to be, several decades ago, that members all lived in DC. And so they had a chance to get to know each other in a more social setting. And again, their kids would go to school together. They would go to the same neighborhood barbecues. In the 1994 Republican Revolution election, which was a huge group of new freshman members who were elected, Newt Gingrich became speaker, and he really actively discouraged members from moving to DC and encouraged them to keep their families in the district and just commute to DC when they needed to. Also, over the last few decades, we've seen, jet planes make it a lot easier for people to commute back and forth.
DC is also phenomenally expensive now, too.
And DC is expensive. Yes, and DC is expensive. And as you're saying, there's a need to fundraise constantly and to be in the district to fundraise. And so as a result of that, there are very few opportunities for members to actually just have, the kind of basic social interaction that you need in order to build a working relationship with someone. One of the things I often point to that I think a lot of people don't realize is that in congressional committee hearings, you usually have one party seated on one side of the room and the other party seated on the other side of the room, and then they're all staring down at the witnesses who are coming to testify. There was a committee that started in 2019 called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And that committee was meant to introspect. It was started in 2019 so that Congress could understand what to change in its processes. But one of the things that committee did internally in the way that it worked was it had alternated seating. It had a Republican member seated next to a Democratic member. And they did that because, we just know from being humans that you just can turn to the person sitting next to you and form an organic conversation. And that makes a huge difference. That did make a huge difference in the way that committee operated. And I think, again, people don't realize how few opportunities there are for members to do even basic things like sit next to each other in Congress today.
Well, I think people also don't know that in many of these committee hearings, it entirely is driven by staff, and we'll talk about staff in a minute, but that the members show up so that they can have their moment for the record and the camera and to use in social media, and then they leave. They're not even there for most of these hearings.
Yeah, they're not there for most of the hearings. I will point out that one of the reasons why they're not there is because they're all living in the district and they fly in. There's what's called the Tuesday to Thursday Club, where many members are only in Washington from Tuesday to Thursdays, and then all the committees have to have their hearings during that time, and they're overlapping in terms of the timing, and there's, not enough coordination in terms of scheduling to avoid that between committees. And then members will come in, they have 5 minutes to speak. They will use those 5 minutes sometimes to make, a kind of a gotcha kind of set of questions to the witnesses, sometimes to ask inquisitive questions. But then the staff will be there really for the majority of the time. And it's really, I think, something that, as you're saying, is kind of misunderstood often if you just look at what's happening on Congress on television.
Yep.
Because on television, you'll only see these soundbite moments that were made for TV. You're not going to see that the hearing lasted 3 hours, and maybe there was another hearing that wasn't even a salacious enough topic to make it to television.
Right.
And what was going on there. You'll only see these soundbite moments. And so one of the points that I make in my new book, Stuck, is that people don't realize that this kind of prophetic influencer power that some members have does not translate neatly into legislative power either. It is
Well, let's
often
be
not.
clear. Some of the most media savvy congressional members in the last decade have passed the least legislation,
Exactly.
right? And some
Exactly.
of the ones who you don't see that often, from my neck of the wood, there are two of them, Lauren Underwood,
Yep.
gets, she doesn't grab the camera, she just gets stuff done.
Yes.
I got a couple others like that here. Then
And I'm
around
glad
Congress, there are people who just went there to do the work, thank God.
100%. And Lauren Underwood is actually a main character in my chapter on the class of 2018 and in the chapter on social media, because she says, she actively kind of makes a choice to do the work.
Yep.
Rather than kind of leaning into the social media viral moments. And as a result of that, I think she's gotten a lot done.
Yep. I mean, you can get stuff done. You can get some things, important things done, but the big questions that Congress has to come together to do, very hard, very hard. So that's money. We've talked a little bit about money, but there are other impediments.
Yes. So one of the things that I think doesn't get enough attention and is, again, a kind of historical trend is that when we compare Congress today to Congress 50 years ago, power today is a lot more centralized in party leaders and just a handful of people than it was once before. It used to be that committees had a lot more power as organizing structures in Congress. And so there's more committee chairs than there are party leaders because there's only two parties. And so you had a little bit more decentralization there. You had the possibility for junior members, at times like in the class of 74, to really rise up through the ranks and get leadership positions and have legislative impact in a way that it's impossible to imagine that they would now.
Is that true for the Senate as well as the House, or is it mostly the House?
I think it's the House, you see it even more in an even more defined way.
Since when? Since the Hastert rule?
So I like to think of the 1970s as really a kind of monumental moment. But if we go back a little bit in the House, and then we can talk about the Senate. 1910, there was a speaker, Joseph Cannon.
Yeah, that's going back a little bit.
Right. So 19, but I'm just gonna give you two.
So let's do it. I love this. Yeah.
1910, Joseph Cannon is a speaker. People think that he is too despotic in his rule, and that power is too centralized. So there is what's called the Cannon Revolt, and members of two parties actually come together. It's a bipartisan revolt, and they overthrow him as speaker. And what happens in the first 50 years of the 20th century is that really the party leaders lose power, and you see committees gain power. Then the 1970s come along. Watergate brings, and the aftermath of Watergate, actually even more so, brings what's a class called the Watergate babies in 1974. They come to Congress, a lot of really young and kind of reform-minded campaigners, and they see these deeply entrenched Southern Democrats in committee leadership positions, and they do what Henry Waxman referred to as topple old lions. They change the rules in a way that disempowers committee chairs because they want to gain power as freshmen. And what you see as a result of that, and then this is compounded by Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, and Nancy Pelosi certainly continues this in the early 2000s. Committees lose power starting in the 1970s, and you see power slowly trickle up into party leadership. So you have a system today where committees are bypassed altogether many times in writing legislation. Often what you see is a system in which party leaders, with the help sometimes of a few lobbyists, write a piece of legislation, push it down very quickly for a vote, sometimes bypassing committees altogether, and members have to vote on the legislation. Sometimes they haven't even read it.
They haven't read, right.
So how is a member going to have
fascinating.
legislative power in that context? Yeah.
That's fair. And like, what did they do to get Cannon out? They named a building after him.
Well, it's also just impossible to imagine now. Think of a context in which right now we would have a bipartisan group of members overthrow a speaker.
Uh, well, I mean, the Democrats bit their tongues, but they had an opportunity.
I just think
So,
partisanship now is not in the same place as obviously as it was in the early 1900s.
no, no, yeah,
But either way, you know, what we have now
these
is a
Republicans
Congress.
overthrowing their own speakers. Yeah,
Yes, and you do have a Congress in which members get elected. A lot of them talk to me about they get elected, they come, they sit down with their staff member, and they say, "These are all the things that I want to do," and then the staff member just laughs in their face and says, "You can't get any of this done as a freshman member." One member that I just did a event with a few weeks ago compared members of Congress to potted plants in terms of the amount of power that a rank and file member has right now. So it's really disheartening, I think, for democracy when you're electing people and they don't have power to make change because, you know, unless they're party leaders, they're close to leaders, it's hard for them to get things done.
okay, so that's got to be enormously frustrating for
Mhm.
every one of the members. So
It
what's
is.
it going to take for them to say this is not acceptable and make, because if they get together, they can change those rules
Mhm.
as they did in
So
1910.
we are sitting here today, just a few months ahead of the midterm election, and there could be another wave election year. We don't know yet, but it
Yes,
looks
we do.
like
There will be.
but it looks like there definitely
Yeah.
could be. And one of the things that we know about wave elections is that there is a lot more collective power at those times. So I mentioned the class of 74, that was a wave election.
Huge wave.
And
Yeah.
so they were able to change rules and take power away from deeply entrenched leaders because of that. 1994, that was a wave election. A different set of things happened then, but Republicans and, you know, Newt Gingrich as speaker really reshaped congressional procedure in a very serious way in the 90s. And if we have another wave election this year, then members elect you know, have to think about what they're going to vote on in a rules package in January and what they're going to push for. And when I spoke to members of the class of 2018, for example, which was another wave election year, they told me that they knew that Nancy Pelosi would need their vote for speakers. And that gave them a little bit more sway, a little bit more influence over what they could ask for as freshmen. So I do think that there could be a moment that we are on the precipice of where Congress can change some
Well, this
internal
is
rules.
so. I've thought for a while that we need to have a few people elected in this next Congress who are less focused on the issues that have been the issues of my lifetime, whether that's healthcare or war and peace or the economy or civil rights, whatever those issues are, and who think like Madison, who are interested in how do we structure the institutions of government so that they are durable and democratic, small d democratic, right? That I took it for granted most of my life. It really wasn't a big issue. It's an issue now.
It
So
is.
your book is going to help, but who are the members that you think are there who are really thinking about these kinds of questions?
So first of all, I just want to reinforce what you're saying. We need also members who are focused on the kind of process and small d democratic issues. I do think that it is heartening to see that so many campaigns on both sides of the aisle really are focusing on anti-corruption agendas. And that includes, members, candidates who are really centering kind of process reforms, banning congressional stock trading, you know, stuff like that, I think is kind of indicative of the fact that people want to see process reform, and that they are angry at the level of corruption in our system. Now, when it comes to members who are there now, first of all, I would lift up some of the members who've already started this work. I mentioned the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Congressman Kilmer, who just retired from Congress, spent years starting some of this work with the Select Committee on Modernization. And that Select Committee was responsible for things like, for the first time, Congress even having a centralized HR department or an IT department, or things that we would think should be basic.
Yeah.
Now that committee is now a permanent subcommittee on the House Administration Committee. And there are folks like Congresswoman Bice and Congressman Morelli and others on that subcommittee who are continuing to think about these process reforms. And I certainly hope that we elect a new crop of members who can kind of add to the ranks
Yep.
of folks who are thinking about this. And I certainly have a lot of conversations, including with folks like Congresswoman Budzinski, and so many others in the House who really care tremendously about making the institution work. I think that there's a lot of folks, including
Yep.
some Illinois Congress people who
Yep.
care a lot about this.
Yep. All right. So we've talked a little bit about money. We've talked about the way power is structured in the leadership. There's also a staff problem.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about
Yes.
that.
So in the 1990s, when Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker, one journalist calls this a time when Congress self-lobotomized. What Congress did was, first of all, to defund an entire congressional support agency called the Office of Technology Assessment, which used to help Congress understand science, which, again, I think we would all agree it still needs help understanding now. It just doesn't have a support agency helping it do that. Gingrich also dramatically decreased funding to other support agencies, like the Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Research Service and the other agencies that help Congress understand and make sense of things. He cut committee staff by a third, just a real dramatic drainage of staff, and Congress has not recovered since then.
Well, and just let me lay that aside or next to, not aside, the fact that at the same time they increase the executive branch in all of these areas, so that the executive branch comes to Congress prepared in a way that Congress isn't to be a counterparty.
Right, and you're very right to point that out, because we have these parallel things, right? We have a growing executive branch and a shrinking legislative branch. And I point that out to people all the time. Congress today has several thousand fewer staffers than it did just a few decades ago. And yet we're expecting it to stand up to the executive. We're expecting it to stand up to Trump. We're expecting it to conduct effective oversight. Well, how can it do that when it doesn't have the brain power to really hold its own? I think that is really a tremendously self-inflicted problem that Congress has to contend with.
Yeah, it's a hard vote to tell in a tough time, you're going to spend more money on staff in Congress when Congress isn't popular. It's a hard vote, but they have to be able to explain that the executive branch isn't popular either, and the overreach is terrifying.
Yeah, and I make this point to people all the time when I talk about Congress. If we want Congress to actually stand up to the executive abuse of power, then we can't just bemoan its ineptitude. We have to help it get better, right? We have to actually strengthen it. Things aren't working. I just wrote a book called Stuck about Congress, so I'm certainly not arguing that they work perfectly, but I wrote that book because I think we need to, more than ever right now, think about unsticking it. We don't have the luxury of waiting, because when we don't have a strong Congress, then we're going to see less of a check on an executive branch that is already, running wild.
Yeah, I mean, let's take a minute or two about the present problem. So Congress has ceded power in every imaginable place. We see on the money side, we see deficiency, where the president spends money Congress never authorized. It's a crime. It's happened. We see oh my God, the word's just gone out of my head. What's the word for the other side, where he doesn't spend what he's supposed to spend? Embargo, impoundment. So we see deficiency and impoundment. So the money side, he said, the Treasury's mine, I'm going to do what I want. Congress could do something about that. We see war, where both on the issues of taking us to war and now of signing a peace, Congress is saying, well, maybe we don't have anything to say about going to war, and maybe we don't have anything to say about treaties. I mean, all of this stuff is, I mean, there's this little book here, but people have read this thing that says, no, this is your job, for God's sake, do your job.
Yeah. Again, I think that the war powers and power of the purse are two major areas where the Constitution grants Congress power over them, and Congress has been ceding this power to the executive. And I know I keep talking about the 1970s, but I just think that the parallels are very clear. 1974, Congress passes the Impoundment Control Act. They
Yes,
did
they
this
did.
because President Nixon impounded tens of billions of dollars. Congress can stand up to these things. And right now, there are conversations in Congress about how to strengthen the Impoundment Control Act and how to get rid of some of the loopholes that presidents in general and Trump in particular have manipulated in the existing statute in order to not spend money that Congress has already authorized. There are conversations right now in Congress about how to strengthen the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which was passed because of the Vietnam War, uh,
Mhm.
and how to strengthen congressional war powers. So, Congress has stood up to executive abuse of power before in these exact areas, and it can do so again. And again, this was not even that long ago that we're talking about
Yeah.
in the grand arc of time when some of this was passed. So, there's one thing for the Constitution to grant authority, as we've seen. There's another thing, to actually how it actually plays out in practice. And that's why you need Congress to stand up again, to strengthen the Impoundment Control Act, to strengthen the War Powers Resolution, and to really take back some of this power.
Congress is an enormously powerful institution if it wants to be,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
except, but that then brings me to we have another branch we just have not talked about.
Right.
Congress thought it dealt with money in politics, but as you point out, Buckley Valeo, Citizens United, there's that third branch that
Right.
sometimes thinks it writes laws. I mean, does Congress have to, as part of the ability to reform, does it need to not just change its relationship with the executive branch, but to change its relationship with the judiciary?
Certainly, I think that in areas where the judicial branch falls short, Congress needs to take a more active stand. I mean, if we look at voting rights and the Calais decision, Congress needs to do more if we're seeing a Supreme Court that is hollowing out the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
Uh,
So how does Congress protect that? But certainly there's Supreme Court reform, but I mean, the radical in me says after we win, we say we're not seating any member who comes from a district that violates the Voting Rights Act. We don't care what the Supreme Court says. Now that is, of course, a terrible thing to do, and we should never do it, right? But I lay it out there as like, you listening, John Roberts? America's talking this way because of your abuse. And Congress, are you listening? Do something.
well, I think two things are important from what you just said. First of all, the institutional legitimacy and faith in institutions cannot be taken for granted. And I think that's something we're seeing with the Supreme Court right now.
They're less popular than the Chicago City Council,
Exactly,
where everybody goes
exactly.
to jail. Yeah.
Exactly. And again, and it's not difficult to understand why. It's the same that we were saying about Congress. I do think that Congress can pass strong legislation like it tried to do with HR 1 and in other instances that strengthen voting rights.
Right.
And instead of, relying on the Supreme Court to do things, I also think that there are Supreme Court decisions that put even more of an onus on Congress to strengthen itself vis-a-vis the executive. For example, the Loper v. Bright decision a few years ago, what's known as Chevron deference. So for
All
years,
of this
Congress
major
could,
questions doctrine stuff
yeah,
is an attempt
exactly.
to say Congress do more work.
Exactly. And I think it'll be interesting, to think about the Trump v. Slaughter case and kind of other cases that relate to separation of powers. Again, as you're saying, all arrows point to the same solution, which is Congress strengthening itself and taking more on and not punting to the executive, not ceding power to the executive, not assuming that the Supreme Court can be relied on for some of these things.
Yeah. Well, or not being willing to let the Supreme Court take it away.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are abilities. There's some clauses in this Constitution that let Congress decide what the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over. That's
Mhm.
those are interesting questions that are going to have to be fought. So the top three things this next Congress could do are what?
It's difficult to choose just three because there's so much that
Top
needs to be done.
five, top eight, the
No,
must do's.
no, I think three is a good number. I always think three is a solid number to go with. So, Must-to-dos. Congress desperately needs to expand its staff capacity. I know we talked about that, and that might seem mundane or even unpopular to folks, but it has to do that because it needs it to stand up to the executive. Congress desperately needs to take back its power of the purse, to actively strengthen the Impoundment Control Act, and to strengthen, for example, the Government Accountability Office, which is the support agency that's supposed to conduct some of this oversight. It really needs to focus on this and to focus on war powers reform and other things to take back some of the power that we're seeing President Trump really usurp. And I also point to, and I hope that a new freshman class can push this across the finish line. Congress is just not organized for success right now. It has not reformed its committee jurisdictions. We didn't really talk about this, but it has not reformed its committee jurisdictions since the 1970s. We are all flummoxed as to why it can't regulate the tech industry. Well, that's because it doesn't even have a tech committee. The last time, committees were reorganized was before the internet existed. So Congress needs to modernize committee jurisdictions, create a tech committee that will actually be able to try to regulate this ballooning and completely underregulated industry. And it needs to really think about organizing itself for success. It's not just the staff capacity issue. It's not just give it more resources. And that's why I wanted to kind of make this a separate point from the staff capacity. It's not just, oh, let's pump it with money. No, we also need to think about the way in which internal structures in Congress are organized so that you're organized for success.
Would you head back to stronger committees, or is there a something that I haven't thought of that would be a way to both have strong leadership and empowered committee structure?
Certainly, I think that we need to strengthen committees, and that would be a way to decentralize power. I've also been arguing for strengthening subcommittees.
But what about the jurisdictions? The jurisdictions of the committees seem dated to me.
Right. So as I was saying, the last time that committee jurisdictional lines were redrawn in the House was the 1970s. So completely outdated. So I shouldn't be surprised that when Mark Zuckerberg comes in to testify, half of the Senate is there. And we know you've worked in organizations, I've worked in organizations, when everyone is in charge of something, no one is in charge of something, in essence. So you need a tech committee if you want to regulate tech. You need generally committee jurisdictions that align with the modern American economy. That's what committee jurisdictions should do. They should align with the kind of economy that you're trying to regulate. And we just don't have that.
That's interesting.
So
yeah. Okay.
That's something that I think we desperately need to do. And if I could just add one more thing, I think that Congress just desperately needs to handle campaign finance reform and needs to pass legislation that that really takes aim at some of these nefarious forces. We see a public that is really hungry for change in this, and that is really angry at Congress and at politicians. And I want to see politicians who center anti-corruption and center getting big money out of politics as part of their platform.
Yeah, I'm hearing it for sure. But here's again where I fear Congress, no matter what they do, the current Supreme Court will say, you can't do it. So we're going to have to deal with both of those.
Yeah.
None of this conversation has been about, okay, look, we've driven the partisanship that's caused these problems by single member districts. Do you take time and think about multi-member districts or proportional representation as ways to take some of the poison out of our politics?
I certainly think proportional representation could take some of the poison out. But even before we get there, I've been advocating for us to expand the House of Representatives. Nowadays, members are serving about 1 million, just under 1 million constituents, 750,000 constituents. The first Congress, they served 30,000 constituents. So, when we think back to the beginning of our conversation of why people are so angry with Congress not doing its job, how could you possibly be serving adequately 750,000 constituents? So we need to expand the House, and certainly we need to do that together with thinking about other innovations like proportional representation, and we need to ban partisan gerrymandering. I think all of that has to happen hand in hand.
Yeah, I think proportional representation takes some of the teeth out of the map making, no matter who's drawing the maps.
Mhm.
Yeah, but yeah, it's um, th- this is the work of decades to make the changes you're talking about, and yet there's incredible urgency to do it right away. Because I mean, it feels like the country feels like we have lost faith in this.
Yeah.
And these institutions, we're going to find some other way, and it's not going to be this democratic way if these institutions don't get their act together. I mean, that's the threat right now. And so can these changes happen quickly? Did
My
they ever, what in these past reforms?
Right, and I think that's exactly where I was going to go. My theory of change is that sometimes policy changes seem to us like they happen overnight, but the reality is that people have been seeding those changes in conversations and in pushes to build policy coalitions and in other things for decades, and then you have to seize the moment when it comes. And so, for example, the changes that I just mentioned in the 1970s, when Henry Waxman and others were, quote, toppling old lions,
Mm-hmm.
those were not changes, those were changes that they helped get across the finish line. But folks who were in Congress already, like Bella Abzug, were pushing for those changes. And in my book,
Pounding the table for them, if I remember correctly.
exactly. And in my book, there's a story of Bella Abzug in a committee hearing when freshmen are pushing for a certain reform. She turns on her mic and she says, "Reinforcements have arrived." Right. So again, there are people in Congress already who are pushing for these changes, and hopefully in November we have some reinforcements that can arrive.
Maya, I really appreciate this conversation, and I couldn't agree with you more. Every big change we've ever had happens after it's already obvious, right? People are like, it'll never happen because everybody knows it should happen and it hasn't happened, so it'll never happen. And that's when it happens.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and in your book, tell everybody when they can get it because it's certainly timely.
So my book is already out, and
Oh,
it
it
is
is. I'm
available.
sorry.
Yeah, recently out.
I know where I'm going
And
next.
and it's available wherever books are sold. It is again called Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. And it is meant to help us understand how we got here in order to understand how we can move forward and unstick Congress.
Well, again, I'm going to go get the book. I hope everybody else does. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.